right. Can everybody hear me all right? Thank you. It's fantastic to be here, and I want to thank Mark and Susan and Jackie who planned this. I think it's a wonderful opportunity, I think as Becky mentioned, to bring together a community of people that are really interested in and dedicated to student success. So I have to say I'm already, I've learned so much in being here already. I've been humbled by the people I meet and the work that they're doing day to day. So thank you all so much for what you do. I really, really appreciate it. And I do want to give a round of applause, though, to Mark and Jackie and Susan for planning this, but this is great. Trying to decide glasses on, glasses off. I can see you, but now I can't see anything here. And hopefully from Mark's introduction, you don't think I have attention deficit disorder with all of the different things that I'm interested in studying, but really it's I keep seeing a connection among, as I study change, different groups that need our attention, different processes and issues, and for me there's a strong synergy amongst these many different kinds of issues that I've looked at over the past 20 years. And what Becky and I did not have the opportunity to meet before we came here to talk about what we'd be presenting, but in an amazing synergy, a lot of the things that that we're speaking about are very similar. And I want to start off with one of, and we both have 4 main points, which I think is really fun too, that we're bringing to you. So 4 main points. And the first one that I want to talk to you about is the issue that Becky brought up in terms of going beyond the program. And I always like to use this word that Daryl Smith, which some of you may be familiar with her work on diversity, she says we have programitis. And that we tend to think the solution for any given problem is yet another program. And that can be helpful, but as I think Becky was trying to point out, it is sometimes not the only option for addressing an issue. It may not be the best option to address a problem or issue for student success. And increasingly, when we have less dollars in higher education and we're really stressed financially, the programmatic, Clark Kerr used to call this that higher education grows by accretion. We just keep adding on more and more. And that was in a time of growth, but we're in many ways no longer in a time of growth, and we have to think about change differently, that it's not just addition of programs, particularly around the issue of student success. So I'm going to emphasize that point, which Becky had made earlier of, well, so how do we think beyond the program then? What does that mean? What is it we can do? And then a second point that Becky and I have some synergy on is this issue. She called it the doable solution, and I actually call it culture change. And she was saying, we need to get, to change people's mindsets. And last night we were talking, she said, but culture change sounds so overwhelming. So I changed it on my slides to deep change. That's what you're going to see instead of culture change. So no one feels really intimidated by this notion of changing the culture. But one of the things I mentioned to Mark is I really don't think cultural change is such a significant and difficult issue in higher education. We have in our minds blown it up into this much larger kind of issue, and so we don't. Instead of looking at how we can create success for all students in the institution, we tend to think of that program rather than we need to think about just what are the small little things that happen when we each, as staff, as faculty, as student leaders, approach our work slightly differently. Just that is what culture change is. It's a slight change in mindset that results in what Becky was talking about when she said the community college faculty, what they did in their classrooms was merely talk for less than 30 minutes in an entire semester about transfer, but that very slight modification had this enormous result. And that, I would say, is a culture change, even though it's what Becky called a very doable sort of small change. So I think that what we're talking about are relatively similar concepts, slight changes in mindset that have huge gains for student success. And that's what we're all of us are here for, is thinking about that larger mission of student success. And I think a third point that Becky and I are going to agree on is this issue of systematically thinking about the student experience towards success. So she mentioned, boy, if you line up all these different points, we know that students should be getting mentoring. It's here in the bridge programs, but then it's also here in a first-year experience course, but then it's also here when they're thinking about what they're going to major in. And then here, I should probably just get this away from me. All right, well, I'll try not to have the yell back at us. But we also need to think about, I gotta just pick up that line of thought. Systematic, so the mentoring. So it's, as they're going into their capstone courses, so she was lining up that there's this systematic process that we need to think about mentoring, that we can't think about it maybe as a one-time opportunity for students, that their success is based on thinking about it throughout the life of their time in school. So I'm going to also reinforce that point. So going beyond the program, how to think about culture change is really important for student success. And then thirdly, how being really systematic in thinking about student success will lead to what I want to really think about is the most scalable and sustained options. So that's the landscape that I'm hoping that I can talk to you about. So these are then my 4 points that I'd like to go over. I'm going to talk first about why change is not only so critical today, but also why it's different in this new era. So I talk about student success in a slightly new era that is different from in the past. So what are some of those kind of conditions and things that make us think about what student success is differently in a time, for example, of increasing technology and social media? How does that make what we think about student success different? And also then, as we look at this whole new era and the kind of issues, new issues that make us think that, well, what student success is today might be slightly different than how I thought about it when, for example, I went to college, necessitates what is this deeper kind of culture change on campus that we need to think about. So and I want to talk about how do we facilitate that among staff, faculty, administrators? How do we achieve some kind of change in our own mindsets about our work? And then third, I want to talk about that to achieve this kind of success, we really need a multi-pronged kind of leadership. And I'm going to use, some of you may be familiar with this, Bowman and Deal's 4 frames of leadership to look at the different ways we need to think about the campus infrastructure to better support students. And then I hope we have some time for discussion, because I know you've been having these really good conversations this morning and kind of try to bring some things together through some of your questions. So student success in this new era. For many years now, so I don't think it's even new, but it continues to change, we have changing student demographics. We've been talking about this for a long time, but I think campuses are finally feeling it more. They have more students from different races and ethnicities. They have more first-generation college students. They have students from varying socioeconomic backgrounds. So we're starting, while we heard about this for a long time, we are experiencing it on many campuses. And so we need to continue to rethink what student success means for an incredibly diverse group of students. It's more individualized in a sense than it ever was, which again leads me to believe that we need more culture change rather than program change. We have increasingly students who are using social media, Twitter, Facebook. They're on internet and blogs. They increasingly are expecting more of a hybrid learning experience. So, and I really encourage those of you on your various campuses to think about the great advantages, actually, of hybrid classrooms to move towards the goals that we've also been advocating for years, which is more active and collaborative learning in the classroom, so that the more that faculty videotape their lectures, then we can have more interaction in the classroom, which we know, for example, is a more successful learning strategy for diverse learners, getting back to the students that we're trying to serve. So how do we really capitalize on the students that are coming and the different ways that they're interacting and the kinds of time that they spend together and the ways that they relate, and think about that in terms of the student activities that we're creating in the classroom experience and leverage this more for their success. And we can use this, for example, to set up, as we talk about certain hard-to-reach groups, sometimes people talk about veterans or transgender students, like how do you use social media to set up then sites for people to connect and have community. We are also in an era where more students are going to college than any other time. There's incredible pressures, both at the federal and state level, to have more students go to college and complete. So we now have a federal, completion agenda. We're trying to increase significantly, and the date's coming up closely by 2020, which is going to be here at the blink of an eye, the number of students going through college, because there are so many jobs that require a college education. And we're not, at this point, as they've been looking at the latest statistics, we're not meeting those goals in terms of increasing the numbers of students getting through post-secondary education. So we need to continue to think about how do we contribute to that broader goal, and particularly among public institutions that are really pressured to do this. In California, we feel these pressures incredibly. I was talking to Mark last night about how we are turning away so many students that are, could successfully get into many institutions, but there's not enough spaces for them, and this is a discredit to students. So we need to think in more experimental ways about how we're going to get education to more students and how we get them successfully through, because we still have really high dropout rates. It's still close to 50% nationally, which is very high. One of the sad things we've all had to face in this sort of new era of student success is decreased funding for public institutions. So we are asked to educate more students, but we've got less money to do it. So again, this suggests that we need to be innovative, because we're not going to get more money to get more students through or to help retain them or to make them more successful. So we've got to try to think about ways to do it, and as Becky used, if we coordinate our activities more, we may be able to do things without creating new programs. But we're going to have to think about ways to have student success with less funding. Now, as Becky said, I don't want this to be the depressing part of the talk where I talk about some of these pressures, because some of them are really, really hard to deal with. Higher education has mostly been a growth market in terms of money and in terms of opportunity, and now we find ourselves in a time of retraction. But as I think Becky knows, this can also be a time of opportunity. So I don't think we need to only think about it, well, we're not going to have increased funding, so how are we possibly going to meet these objectives around student success? We need to think about the greater efficiencies that we can have, and there's a really great example of this from the University of Maryland system that they went through, and systematically the chancellor had them go through and really re-look at their systems to try to recapture money so that they could lower tuition for students, so they could have more money for scholarships, so that they could increase the programs that were really successful for students, but looked at the efficiency and productivity of a lot of areas on campus that weren't as efficient or productive as they could have been. But a lot of times we're afraid to do these more kind of systematic audits of the system with the aim of student success, because in the end, they could do things that were going to be really important for students. We have to keep those tuitions in check. We've got to have more scholarship money. We have to have the programs there that they need. We're also, continuing. We're getting a higher education reauthorization again coming up this year. We continue to get more. We're in an environment with more regulations increasingly in higher education, more legislative demands on us. So that means that we're constantly having to say, what do I have to do in terms of alcohol enforcement on campus, or sexual assault, or different kinds of policies that are increasingly coming down to campuses as areas that we need to be responsive to external stakeholders that are really wanting us to be more accountable. Many of you, I'm sure, are feeling from leaders on your campus a pressure to think more about our students are going to go out into a more globalized world. So student success doesn't just mean, in a sense, being able to finish their education, be a good citizen, and get a job. They also need to recognize that they're more in an international landscape, that they may be working in different places in the world over time, that the companies that they're with, they need to have cross-cultural skills to work with people in different countries, so that the students that we graduate have to have a much more international perspective. And what are we doing to think about that in terms of their success over time? I've mentioned this already, is the kind of increasingly those sort of new student populations that come to campus that we're not necessarily set up and prepared to deal with. We've been talking about the diversity in terms of race or ethnicity or socioeconomic class for the last 20 or 30 years, but particularly the issue of veterans and students with learning disabilities are newer challenges that many of our campuses haven't been as prepared for or talked about. And we can add on to this list, there are other groups that many of you, I'm sure, are experiencing that we need to think of as the portfolio of student success expands. Also, accountability are really reshaping us. Accreditors are saying that we need to have student learning outcomes that we've designated at all of our campuses, that we're going to assess those outcomes for students, and that the public should know and be aware of, and I think there's going to be some kind of report card from the Department of Education eventually that says, this is how institutions line up in terms of meeting their student learning outcomes. And so we need to realize that the sort of the era of trust of higher education, that you bring in smart and brilliant people, and unfortunately they've come to realize we don't necessarily have great retention and success rates though. And this has made them really nervous. They've lost their sense of trust in us and accountability because of those low retention and completion rates that they know about. And so there are these increasing calls for, we want to make sure that our taxpayer money for those public institutions is being used well, and that you are really, in a sense, monitoring the student, taking care of them, ensuring them through a safe pipeline through your institution. And I know these are things we all care about, but now the external world is starting to care about these issues, and those come in the ways of new things we will have to do, whether we are faculty or whether we are staff, in terms of reporting how we're contributing to students' learning eventual outcomes that accreditors will be coming to look at over time. So these are just, as I said, to name a few, because we have only so much time together. But I want to give you this sense of we're in this slightly new era that college campuses need to think differently about their work around student success. And lots of people outside our individual campuses care about this, have a stake in this. And increasingly, unfortunately, if we don't do better, this will become more intrusive on our campuses in terms of trying to make sure that we're better at student success. So while these are challenges, I think they also present opportunities, because I think we can do better than we have in the past in our retention rates, at our success with particular groups. We know we have really, really gaps between the graduation and success rates of students from diverse backgrounds or women in STEM disciplines. We have areas that we know we've had many challenges on, but as Becky noted, why isn't it happening? Why aren't we doing more? So that's one of the things that has interested me for a long time. So why did I even start to study or think about change? And probably like many of you in this room, I recognize some of these really incredibly important things that higher education could and should be doing. I realize that any of you could stand up in this room and talk about a program or an intervention that you have that's really meaningful to students. But what I was wondering is, why aren't these things more widespread? Why do we hit only a certain number of students? Why isn't it, that institutions more largely had this kind of success with students? Why are we so hit or miss, so unsystemic, so non-scaled on some of these issues. So I wanted to study that issue in particular of more scaled, sustained, meaningful, and lasting changes that can happen on campuses. And I got involved in a lot of research projects that tried to study that issue of deep change and how do we make it happen. So I want to share a few of those lessons with you today that I've tried to learn over the years. And also I've done studies of leaders and the role of leaders in change, because one of the key things that comes out of these studies of deep change is the significant, very significant role of leaders at multiple levels. So I've looked at somebody who's an entry-level professional in their office and the way they can lead substantially to a change effort, somebody who's an associate dean or a director of a program, and I've looked at the role of faculty at multiple levels, as well as presidents, provosts, and board members. Each of these contribute. We need this kind of multi-level leadership to have meaningful change. It can't just happen at one level or the other. So here's my reflections then on if we want change in this new era for student success, what are the kinds of things that you all might do to create this change? So the first is recognizing that we do need to move beyond programs, and we do need to think about being a part of changing, if you will, the mindset on your campus, in your unit. And at some of my examples, I'll use campus, but you could just as likely use these as a unit. Because when we talk about culture, culture is not monolithic. We don't just have a campus culture. You have cultures within different units. And you can change, one of the ways we change culture is changing one unit and then expanding out and expanding out and expanding out. So if you can just think about what is this, in my sphere of control, what element of culture might I affect? It might only be a small segment of 5, 6 other people, but that is starting to change the culture, which will start to expand out, and how you then connect to other people. And then the second issue is that the two key ways I want to talk to you about in terms of engaging in deep or cultural change are notions of what we call sense-making or organizational learning. They're two vehicles that really help people to change their mindsets. We're really saying, how do we get people to just think differently about their work? And those are two really good strategies that any of us in the room can engage in. And then I want to talk about 5 core strategies that we found within different studies I've done on transformational change on campuses, ones that had sustained and scaled up change that happened. What were some of these 5 strategies that you can try to have in place? And then I'm going to talk about more as an individual leader, how you can use a multi-frame approach to create deep change. All right, so sense-making. What is sense-making? So it's really just a new understanding of how I do work, but it's usually facilitated in a social interaction with other people. And so an example might be that I, as a faculty member, think good teaching is when I give a very profound lecture and then I have a really great set of PowerPoints. That's my notion of good teaching. But then, after I engage with a variety of other professionals to think about the notion of good teaching, I might come out at the end of it, and this would be sense-making, thinking, I really think good teaching and learning involves very active and collaborative learning. So I'm going to put my lecture up on a video so that students can see it beforehand, so that when they come to class, we're really engaging in problem solving, and that I use a lot of social media techniques that students are engaged with in my classroom between classes to engage them, because I know that they're thinking about things not just in the moments we're in class, but the ways that I can leverage outside of class time to get them involved with social media, to have discussions when they're thinking about it, maybe after they've discussed with some peers in a session after the class, and then they've got a question for me, that I'm engaging them more simultaneously and not thinking about teaching and learning as one moment in time. So my notion of good teaching changes from one notion to another. And that's what we're trying to do, is to get people to take very basic ideas. What is student success? So for some of you, you might think student success is being really involved in co-curricular activities and having decided early on what your major is, and participating in events on campus. That may be your definition of student success. But it doesn't include what we're trying to do in rethinking and sense making, is get you to see that might be one version of student success, but some students have to work, and some students don't have the opportunity to participate unless we amend the way that we're operating our programs to being shorter snippets of time. As Becky mentioned, the long summer internship, if you have another option for somebody who's working or that's part-time so they can participate in something in a more part-time option, recognizing they work, recognizing they may take more time to decide on their major, but they're still successful. So getting different notions of what student success looks like for students from different backgrounds would be a new version of sense making. So what we try to do in sense making is facilitate how do we get in those discussions to change people's mental models, because we all have them. You all have a mental model of what's a good student experience, what is a good program, what is good advising. Pick it, whatever you're doing, you have a mental model of what it is. And what I would suggest to you is we probably all need, because of those forces that I talked about earlier, to change our mental models. Our mental models might not include diverse students, might not include the uses of technology or social media, might not contain an element of internationalization, might not contain the most efficient or productive way to do that outcome, may not contain thinking about, have I mapped down and will be able to explain to another outside external agent how I was successful in this program? Am I, for example, assessing the work that I'm doing? So we often have to expand our mental models to fit what are the important aspects of student success in the era in which we live. And so because we live through historical time periods, our mental models get frozen sometimes and they don't keep up. And for those of you who are newer professionals, sometimes our mental models are impacted by also a more limited experience that we had. And the more that we learn about different kinds of backgrounds or experiences, the more we can expand the way we think about the work that we do. Does that make sense? So I want you to just take that minute to think about what's your mental model for your work, and how might just a few of the ideas, and then each of you on your own campuses, I brought up some of the things that have changed, right? Some of the elements we need to think about for student success, but you might say, and one of the reasons I don't like to ever prescribe anything is we all come from such different institutional contexts, different institutional types, different students, different challenges, that what the kinds of things you might need to challenge in your mental model are different. But I just want you to, as I'm going through the next couple slides, think about that. Think about how you think about your work, how other people in your office, maybe, and sometimes we have the issue of, we actually have this other new mental model that probably more people need to have. Then you might want to think about, what are the other mental models in my office? What's the dominant mental model about how we should do this work? What does it mean to be a good advisor, or good in student activities, or good in career placement and planning? So maybe it's not even focusing on yours. Sometimes we are the possessor of the mental model that's more expanded. But we need to recognize that other people have different mental models, and we don't collectively shift in terms of our work unless more people are rethinking their mental models about how they do their work and about what student success means. So if you will, plant that in the back of your head for a few minutes and think about it. And then I'm going to describe to you some of the ways that no matter what level you're at in the institution, entry-level professional, again, director of a unit or division, vice president, at any of these levels, you could have the opportunity to shift and change people's mental models about their work. And part of the ways you can do this these are some examples of what you might do. And these are real examples of campuses that have made really significant shifts in the way people think. These are some of the strategies they used. So they might create a campus reading group around, here I'm saying college completion, you fill in the blank for the challenge that you're dealing with. Maybe it's transfer student success. Maybe it's first generation student success. Whatever the issue is, what might we bring together, a campus reading group around that might read, for example, Vincent Tinno has a new book out that's really examining some important strategies we can use on campus, particularly to help first generation college students, so it helps on that college completion level. But, get people to think about new ideas. And sometimes, if you're one, I'll call it, who possesses the more expanded mental model, you're a great person to pick the book for the group because you recognize some of the areas that people might need to think about or expand their thinking in. And this is a way you can help facilitate it, because one of the things that we do know, though, is people need to go through sense making with other people, but yet on their own. So this is the thing. If I just walk in the room and go, you got a really problematic mental model. What you need to do is think this way, that we don't change people's mind that way. They have to go through a learning process with us, with other people. So one of the things that I too often see is leaders think, well, I got this insight. I got this insight. I now know first generation college students, they have these experiences, and I need other people to realize it. So they just kind of go into a meeting and they say, hey, you all need to think differently about your work. But that's not how it happens, right? I need to go through my own individual learning process. I can't be told how to think differently. So sense making's about that shift in mental models, but also the vehicles, really important vehicles that can do that. So creating a campus reading team, that's the kind of vehicle where we sit together, read about it, debate it, think about the ideas, and then I can come into that insight sort of on my own, but with other people. So it helps to have the interaction, but it also helps to have that time for you to process it alone. We can also create a cross-campus working group devoted to exploring strategies to improve college completion. So one of the things that we talked about in terms of being systematic and in terms of doing this work better is the collaboration. And what collaboration also does is, I may never talk to faculty that often if I'm in maybe I'm trying to think of an office that wouldn't, probably advising and career planning they do, but maybe student activities they do less so. So you try to think about what are the kinds of different individuals that are important to thinking about student success that may not interact as much, and how do we get them to interact more on a cross-campus team, and how can they share ideas? So it may be that that you bring together people around a campus reading group, but sometimes it's even just getting different people who don't normally interact in a room together around a task. So you're tasked with rethinking, like, we have some problems around college completion, and I need you to think about these challenges. Inviting in speakers. So sometimes we need to mix up the ideas on our own campuses, and this is a more common strategy, so many of you probably do this, but sometimes we just do it out of our interest rather than targeted to a specific challenge we have on campus. Like, how do we invite somebody in around a specific challenge in an area that we need to expand our mental models and do some thinking? So you might invite a speaker like Vince Tinto to campus to talk about his recent work on improving college completion. Again, these are sometimes natural things we do, but we don't think about them as opportunities, I'll call it, for sense making. And these campuses recognize these as opportunities for sense making to consciously build into the agenda of, say, a public forum. So you're getting together people for a convocation, but you decide to talk a little bit about how we need to think differently about student success and the challenges, for example, for first-generation college students. And that gets dropped into a lot of public forums so that people who attend start, if I hear from a lot of important people on campus that this is something we should be thinking about, it's more likely to be integrated into my thinking. So adding it into public speeches and events on campus. Also important is thinking about professional development that you might do. So whether it's a brown bag series that you put together, some kind of ongoing time where people can come and talk about a significant issue where we're trying to shift our mental models. on that issue. So professional development will work. And sometimes even people put together their ideas like, on our campus, this is kind of like a strategy we're developing for helping first-year students. They would put it together even just sort of a short concept paper to solidify their ideas and send them out to different people on campus to get their feedback, and just having people think back through and try to process, well, what would our office do differently to serve first-year college students? And being invited to do that and to contribute to a concept paper helps shift people's thinking. So these are just a sampling, but it's those ways that I get you to think about the work that you're doing and to potentially expand the way you're thinking about doing your work. So that's one strategy, and I will say it's a very, very successful strategy, and sometimes is a little bit easier than this other strategy that I'm going to talk about, which is organizational learning. Another really fantastic way to shift people's mental models, to have them think differently. But this requires, on some campuses, they don't have as good a data infrastructures to facilitate this. But I do think that this can be a really important way as well. So organizational learning is simply using data at whatever unit, right? So this can be, it doesn't have to be the overall campus. It doesn't have to be working with your IR office, although it can be, to get information so that you can really look at the issue of first-generation college student success. So how are we doing with them? What happens the first semester? Let's look at the data. How many are entering our campus? How many are staying through the end of the first year? When seems to be the major dropouts? Looking, are they in different majors? Do we have certain majors they're not going into? So you start really exploring the data to understand the issue and the problem more deeply. And so what it helps people to do is rethink their mental models, because they might notice as they look at this data things we're not being successful in, and then things we need to rethink the way we do our work through the examination of data. So you're using the data just the way you might use the campus reading groups or the cross-campus teams as ways to stimulate ideas. So it's using data instead to stimulate those ideas that change our mental models. And you can use both of these, right? So it's not necessarily one or the other, but they're different ways to stimulate new and different thinking, which shifts the culture. So a lot of times campuses need to start, though, because of accreditation and because of the shift of having us be much better data collectors, many more campuses have more sophisticated IR offices, but their purview is usually external. It tends to be, I am producing reports for all these external agencies that now have a lot more accountability and control over higher education. And so a lot of shift has to happen sometimes for people to think about how they use data more internally. How do they get reports and shifts? And IR offices aren't necessarily always good at packaging data for a staff team that may not be, used to reading. Sometimes I've seen IR offices give like raw data reports rather than cleaned up, presented data that's easier for any one of us to read in the room who isn't an expert in interpreting data. So one of the things is really kind of shifting potentially the way either you ask for data from the IR office or your interaction to get a good, robust data infrastructure so that you can start to get the data that'll help you to examine the issues in a different way. But on some campuses, you've already, I've heard various people talking about some really good interactions they already have with their IR offices and ways they're getting data, but this can sometimes be a challenge, which is why I bring up the sense-making option, because anybody can kind of utilize the sense-making option without being dependent on getting data. So typically, again, the data gets, that it's not just the data itself, it's teams that get together across various units that are important to student success, whether it be advising programs, first-year experience programs, faculty in different units, the library. So it's getting a cross-campus team together that looks at this data in meaningful ways, that examines it and says, what would this mean in terms of interventions? What are the existing problems that we have, and what kind of interventions might we put into play or rethink? Or how does this suggest different ways we do our work? So that's constantly the question, is trying to come up with new ways to think about our work. So I'm gonna shift this out of this, because I think I've got us thinking about new mental models. Hopefully everybody is starting to think about How do they think about their own work, and how might they expand it, and how might you contribute to an effort to expand that thinking? Can you invite somebody to campus? Is there data that you can collect and is accessible to have people examine the issue, and getting people together on teams? Again, it's a lot about this is the interaction. How do you get, even if it's a small group of your colleagues and peers to work together? So point number 2 is there are several of these strategies that help us think about making this scaled and sustainable. And I brought this one up a couple times now, and I'm going to say it one more time because it's so important. We need collaborative leadership, and that's leadership at each level. So many times I've heard people say, well, if you want deep change, you just really need the top level of the institution to mandate it and kind of force people to move in this new direction. So if we want to have more success with first-generation college students, we just need the president to really believe in it and to put that as a priority for the campus. And we just know that doesn't work. A strong top-down approach it's helpful to set some priorities, but we really need leadership throughout the institution, and that's that ownership of the culture. Every one of us saying, no, student success will only happen if each one of us owns that. It's part of our responsibility at every unit. So everyone in this room is responsible and has a leadership role in student success, and it's really just thinking about how do I exercise that leadership? What's my particular role? What's the best way that I can do it? And thinking that I also need to manage up. Too often I've seen people say, well, somebody right above me doesn't care about first-generation college students, so therefore, there's not a lot I can do. Instead of, as I said, well, you can slip them that book about, like what are the ways, they call it managing up, that you can influence people who you work with to shift their mindset so it may become a priority for them to want to support first-generation college students. And sometimes we have people who say in rhetoric they'll do it, but then when it comes to setting priorities or allocating money, it doesn't go there, right? So we still need to work on that, because that means their mental model really hasn't shifted. And in order to get collaborative leadership, so these campuses that have deep change, have leadership at multiple levels, have collective ownership and responsibility, that student success is everyone's responsibility. They have what they call flexible vision. So instead of defining, well, student success at this campus looks like X, Y, or Z, because we all have to set priorities. So usually, a strategic plan has 2 or 3 sets of priorities and a couple of goals underneath it. But instead, this is saying, I'm going to float this idea of a vision for student success and allow every one of these multiple levels of leadership to contribute to that, to significantly change and alter it over time, because too much of, again, a top-down vision of where we're going to go doesn't allow people to want to participate and join the effort. So having a flexible vision as they move forward on trying to think about student success helps with that. Senior administrative support is really like if we at this multiple levels of leadership develop some key ideas around somebody new we need to hire, or a program that we might have to put in place, even though we're trying to move away just from programs as the only solution, you need to know that there is senior administrative support to put those things into place. So without that, there becomes a frustration of, we did all this good thinking and we developed all this leadership, but there wasn't then either the resources or priority setting behind it to make it go into place. I won't bring up much about professional development, I've talked about that a lot in terms of sense making, but at multiple levels they made sure that there was professional development in place to evolve people's thinking and mental models, as we've talked about. And then they made sure to assess and see that there was action taking place. To keep people on long-term, deep, sustained change, you need to be able to see that some progress is being made. So they made sure to collect that evidence of what was happening that was improving, say, first-generation student success, and to make people on campus aware of that success and build on it. So those are the things that help them sustain long-term change. And all things that are very doable. So the last point I want to make to you is that the leadership that you employ to try to shift the culture for student success, really needs to take what we call a multi-frame, which is more systematic. And one of the things that we know is that people tend to have, various surveys have been done with leaders both in higher education and other sectors, that we tend to have a bias towards one way we look at the organization. So we'll really utilize a lot of strategies, say maybe around training, like the kind of the solution. If we want to have more success for students, we just really need to think about training staff in these ways, and that's the solution. Or we tend to think about a structure we can put in place. So if we want to support diverse students, we just have to make sure there's a multicultural center in place. So we tend to think about strategies, single strategies for student success along a particular line that's aligned with the way we look at the organization rather than a more holistic, multiple approach. So I just want to suggest to you what that kind of leadership could look like that leads itself to a broader, more systematic kind of leadership. There's my bias. All right, so here's the 4 frames. Structural human relations. I'm just going to, I'll just go through this very quickly. This is the slow PowerPoint. So the 4 frames that they talk about are a structural lens, which is seeing the organization. They use these metaphors as more as factory. This was sort of the early studies of organizations focus more on the, if you will, the organizational chart as a way to understand how the organization operates. They talk about human relations as understanding that organizations are more than just the structures in which they exist. They also have people, and those people need to be the right ones who are hired and trained and put into place. They look at the political infrastructure, that every organization also has a system of people who are networked and allied and who develop agendas and who have different interests, and that's an important frame for creating change. And then lastly, a symbolic frame, that each of our organizations have a meaning system and a set of values, which is one of the things I've been talking to you a lot about, is that it's that underlying value system that we're trying to shift that will be important towards deep, sustained systemic change. But they said looking at all 4 of these realms is really significant to a successful change strategy. So I'm just going to give you a little bit on each of the frames. So the structural frame, and if you're somebody who comes from this perspective and it addresses change from a structural frame, you tend to think about what goals can we set up around student success? Do we have the right roles and people in various positions that are aligned to help students succeed? You're looking also at how do we create the right policies, transfer policies. If we have the right transfer policies, then we know that the students from the community colleges are going to have a better opportunity of going to the university. So you're thinking about these various structures that are set up with our institutions that either lead to success for students or don't. And that's a really important infrastructure to think about, but it's just one. So this is what they said, is we need to have success, we need to think about all of these infrastructures at the same time. And as I said, if you're biased towards this lens, you're also going to be biased towards thinking about a structural solution then to any issue, rather than, you may ignore say the value system at play. So these are some examples that you might think about in terms of your own campuses. So using a structural strategy for student success, we can set up an office to support students of color. We can provide new policies for guiding international students through their first year. We can establish a formal plan and goals for better completion rates, and we can assess learning and co-curricular programs. So these are all strategies that I'm sure some of you use. But the idea here is, how do I think about not just one of these strategies, but all of these strategies together as important to student success? So the second area is the human relations frame. And so again, this is the concept that for creating meaningful change, we've got to hire the right people. We've got to socialize them when they come into what is student success on this campus. We've got to get them the right training so that they can fulfill their responsibilities in professional development. We've got to make sure that there's a good fit between them and their role. And we've got to make sure that people are satisfied and motivated. Sometimes on our campuses, we don't provide that environment for people to feel like they're excited about going to work every day. And then it affects how they interact with the student. So the better that somebody's morale is, the more successful they'll be in interacting with other people. So again, if you're somebody who comes from this human relations perspective in terms of as a leader, you might tend to think about change in terms of, well, we just have the wrong person in this role, and if we could get rid of them, we got to fire them, get a new person in this role, then we'll be much more successful in student success. We've got a misalignment here in terms of the fit for this office. So this would be the way you might look at it. So instead, from a human relations perspective, then you can think of these kinds of strategies for student success. Provide professional development on social media and learning for faculty and staff so that they can think about ways they could integrate that into whether it's their programming, their classroom. Ensure staff have skills on assessment when they're being hired, so you can look at that as a desirable skill since we know more campuses are going to have to be assessing learning. Encourage exchange of staff between countries where campuses are opening a branch campus. So again, as we think about a more international dimension, how do we develop people's skills in that area? And then provide avenues for staff to have feedback on plans to improve completion rates. So it's involving staff as a way to create the kind of change we're looking for. This is always the hardest one. So I say the first two, most people, as particularly in student affairs, most people score really highly and are oriented towards a human resource lens and even slightly a structural lens. But when I get into the political and symbolic, these are a harder stretch. And most educators on the Bowman and Deal leadership frame score very highly on the first two. And then this is where we tend to have a little bit more fall off. So I just emphasize that these are two strategies that are really, really important for us to use and are very, very significant, probably, I hate to say it, the most significant in creating meaningful change. So the first is political or advocacy frame. And I changed it to advocacy because so many people in education really have a negative connotation to politics. They look at it as like this backhanded deals where people negotiate, like more manipulation than when you think of positive advocacy, like community advocacy, where people, are making sure that the low-income people in their community have the best resources. When they think about it that way, they go, oh, okay, I can see how a political lens of being an advocate is important. So this lens recognizes that all of us in this room, we don't share the same interests. Even if we're in the same division, student affairs, there are different interests, mindsets, ideologies. But especially as you expand out to campus, there are lots of different points of view on campus and different interests represented. And we try to, instead of, because we're afraid that that will take away from student success rather than lead to it. So one of the things that is important for us to do is to recognize that conflict is inherent, and if we're actually going to have success for students, we have to start to engage those kinds of conflicts and see them as natural. So in this strategy, it's really looking at how do I recognize different interests, bargain and negotiate with different groups, create coalitions, and build agendas for change. So these are some of the strategies that you might use. So you might form a network with other offices that support students of color to ensure their budgets are not cut. You might use assessment results to leverage support for a new leadership program. You might create an agenda on campus around college completion using identified allies that you've got. Or you might recognize that many of the faculty and staff don't have a broader international awareness and see reallocations of funds as endangering the mission. So just even recognizing that interest. So these are some of the mindsets or mind frames you can bring from a political perspective that can help you facilitate change. I'm starting to go a lot more quickly because I realize I'm running out of time. So I just want to mention the last frame, which is a symbolic frame. And in many ways, I've covered this in some of my earlier comments because sense-making and organizational learning are very much about changing mental models and underlying assumptions, and the symbolic frame is very much about that part of the infrastructure. Is that in every organization, people have an underlying value system, underlying meaning system that is impacting the way the organization operates. These underlying values and assumptions get represented in the symbols and the rituals and the ceremonies that we have on campus. So very often we talk about this, an example is when we talk about diversity is looking at who do we have as speakers, who do we have pictures up on the wall, sort of those kinds of things represent the artifacts in our culture, what we think of in terms of diversity. So it's the stories we tell, it's the events that we have and who speaks at them. and all this sort of way that it's also embedded in our mission and visions of our institution. So those underlying meaning systems. So the ways you might use a symbolic frame to facilitate student success is think about, for example, if you're at a Jesuit institution, you could appeal to a social justice value to encourage more support for a diversity initiative. You might have key leaders describe the importance of assessment for the integrity of campus work. You might relate a new technology initiative to a campus history as being an innovator. You might hold a separate graduation for first-generation college students to support them as a symbol of their success, or tell stories from your own background of how students of color did not succeed to impress how you don't want this to happen under your watch. So these are different ways that we motivate people through a symbolic perspective, both to change and to represent that change. So in closing, what you're really trying to do is try to think across these various strategies, how they can be harnessed for student success. So think about, again, you might be much more likely to think about the human resource or even the structural dimension, but how can you integrate more political and symbolic strategies in the way you go about creating change, in the way you think about those things on campus that need to be changed to foster student success? Because even if you aim at the structures, the students still see the human interactions, they still see the underlying value system, and they're still seeing that political system at play. So if we're not altering those, we're not ultimately altering the institution, we're altering one part of it. Sometimes we don't possess all the skills to do these, so we create leadership teams that have these skills. So it's important for you to even recognize, where do you have skills in these different areas of leadership? And it's online. You can get the Bowman and Deal inventory if you want to take it just to see where your strengths are and what are those areas you might build or team up with other people who have other skills, who have stronger political or symbolic skills. So the reason, again, I presented culture change rather than a specific intervention to help student successes, we each have individual contexts, and what student success is going to be on your campus differs. But for all of our campuses, there's going to have to be a change in mindset or mental models to have scalable, sustainable change for student success. So I just really encourage you to think back about what could I do in my sphere of influence to create different sense making. Again, so who can I send that book to or invite that speaker? And how might I be a part of that collaborative leadership on campus? And what can I do to encourage those things that lead to deep change? So how do I encourage the kind of professional development or the assessment of our success? So all those strategies are things we can feed into. And just don't be afraid of, as I said, use a multi-pronged strategy. Don't be afraid of politics, of trying to impact the culture, as well as looking at the human resources and structures on campus. Those are the books. And I know we don't really have much time for questions. But thank you very much.